Thank you, everybody, for coming for the second installment of the final presentation by our honor students at the Center for International Security and Cooperation. Today, we have three. First, Gabriela Reitz, Emma Barrosa, and then Nicole Benalcázar-Pavlik. And Gabby will take us away, but before that, I would just want to mention a few housekeeping rules. Each of the speakers will have 20 minutes for their presentations, and then we'll have about 10 minutes of Q&A. The first question traditionally goes to their faculty advisor. If you need to change in and out of the room in between the presentations, that's totally fine. Just be sure to be quick. And if you need to chat after your friends have presented, please make sure to go downstairs or ideally out of Encina, because as you see, we took the walls down. So it is very loud and we might be able to hear you. So please make sure to leave quietly so we can hear the next presenter. Other than that, I think we'll just let those guys take their seats and then have Gabby take us away.
Perfect. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Gabriela Reitz, and I'm so honored to be speaking in front of you guys today. My honors thesis is called Between Ideals and Interests, Brazil's Foreign Policy Response to the War in Ukraine. And I'm going to start by highlighting two key dates. First, in July of 2019, President Trump designated Brazil as a major non-NATO ally, signifying that the US views Brazil as a close strategic partner. Jump forward 3 years, and in February of 2022, Russia invades Ukraine, starting what has since become the largest conflict in Europe since World War II. Brazil's response to the war has been nuanced. On one hand, President Lula has publicly condemned Russia's invasion, arguing that the act violated Ukraine's rights and sovereignty. He has also been an advocate for peaceful resolutions to the conflict, proposing a peace club and working with other nations to find a diplomatic agreement. This rhetoric rang true in the UN as well, the United Nations, where Brazil has voted to condemn Russia's aggression. On the other hand, Brazil's response has come in conflict with much of what the US and the West want in terms of the war in Ukraine. Brazil has limited discussions on the conflict in official multilateral platforms. They refuse to send weapons to Ukraine, despite the US and other allies asking them to do so. President Lula has maintained amicable relationships with Russian leaders, inviting President Putin to Brazil despite an arrest warrant out for him from the International Criminal Court. And Lula has gone so far as to argue that President Zelensky of Ukraine is as responsible for the war as President Putin. Overall, Brazil has taken a hedging position on the conflict, meaning that the country is choosing not to side with one country or the other. Why is this? Why is it that Brazil, which just a few years ago was designated a major non-NATO ally, now going directly against the West's wishes, and at times even supporting Russia? This situation leads me to my main questions. First, case specific, what factors lead Brazil to take a hedging stance on the conflict in Ukraine? And second, stepping back and looking at the broader picture, how do medium powers respond to great power conflict? These questions are what my thesis aims to answer. In this presentation, I'll begin with an overview of my methodology, and then look at Brazil's response to great power conflict in United Nations specific situations, and then shift to considerations outside of the UN, and then concluding with a summary of my findings and their implications. First, my methodology. My research is divided into two parts. The first is proving that a change in Brazilian foreign policy has occurred, and that Brazil is aligning increasingly less with the United States on issues related to great power conflict. The second is answering why that change has happened. To address the question of whether change has or has not occurred, I apply a mixed method approach. First, I conducted a historical review, gaining a general understanding of Brazilian foreign policy over the past 30 years, and what the priorities and actions have been from administration to administration. Then I conducted an analysis of Brazil's voting habits at the United Nations. To do this, I collected data on over 2,000 UN votes from the past 30 years and calculated how often Brazil voted in line with the US, with China, and with Russia. Using these numbers, I plotted how Brazil's alignment with the great three superpowers has changed over time, which is this plot here, and we'll come back to this in a little bit. So first, has a change occurred? My answer is yes. Through the first part of my research, I found that both in the UN and outside of it, Brazil is increasingly diverging with the US in its response to great power conflict, even outside of just the war in Ukraine. While I don't have time to go too in-depth in this research right now and how I reached my conclusion, I'm happy to talk about it more in the Q&A. So now that the change in Brazil's foreign policy has been established, I moved to answering the question of why this change occurred. To do so, I applied a variety of methods. First, I looked at changes in Brazil's foreign policy at the United Nations through both voting habits and its rhetoric in speeches given in the space. So that's these first two bullet points. And then to supplement that data, I conducted a number of interviews and worked with secondary sources to understand some of the informal motivations for Brazil's response to the war in Ukraine that may come out outside of the official UN spaces. Okay, let's jump right in. Why did this change happen? And we'll look first at the UN specific considerations. So as we saw before, this is the chart for the first dependent variable I explored, which is UN votes. As you can see, there's 3 lines, and each one represents Brazil's average alignment with US, China, and Russia each year for the past 30 years. Interestingly, there appears to be an inverse relationship between when Brazil votes with the US, this line on the bottom, and when it votes with China and Russia, the 2 lines on the top. Next, I collected data on specific independent variables, which, again, I don't have time to go into the details of all of them here, but this is just a glimpse of what the data I was collecting looked like. So I was looking at Brazilian imports and exports from and to US, China, and Russia, Brazil's military cooperation with these 3 countries, foreign direct investment into Brazil from these 3 countries, and foreign aid. Again, happy to talk about them on my Q&A, but these were the independent variables I used. And then using this data, I run a Pearson correlation coefficient, which measures the linear relationship between each independent variable and the voting trends from the first graph, represented with the value R. So this is one example of the correlation chart. It's a lot to look at, so we're not going to look at a lot of them today, but you have the general idea of if an independent variable and dependent variable are heavily correlated, the color is darker and the number is closer to -1 or +1, and the lighter colors and numbers closer to 0 means less correlation. After running many regressions on each of the independent variables and dependent variables, I created a chart for each of for one of these charts for each dependent variable. And after looking at all those charts, there's a few things that stand out. First, there's a strong negative correlation between Brazil's alignment with the US and its alignment with China and Russia. As you can see, strong dark colors and high numbers close to 1 suggest that as Brazil votes more with the US, its alignment with Brazil and Russia go down. So again, this supports the idea of 2 opposing foreign policy groups where you're either with one group or the other. Second, certain factors you might expect would impact Brazil's voting habits didn't, according to the analyses I ran. For example, there surprisingly is a negative correlation between the level of imports from Russia to Brazil and Russia's voting alignment at the UN, which you would expect to be the opposite. You'd think that if imports from Russia are going up, then Brazil would be more inclined to vote in line with Russia. And the same is true for China, whereas exports to China went up, Brazil and Russian alignment went down. This could be for a few reasons, and the primary hypothesis is that, in general, during the late 1990s and early 2000s, Brazil's economy was growing pretty rapidly, and thus it was opening up to the global economy and was receiving more imports and exports from all 3 countries, not just Russia, so also US and China, and thus it has not as much of an influence on the correlation. That's the hypothesis. But that said, there are some correlations that did make sense. For example, there's a negative correlation between the level of Brazil's military cooperation with the United States and Brazil's voting alignment with Russia, suggesting that as one goes down, the other goes up. The key takeaway from this is that while the independent variables explored in this section have some correlation with Brazil's voting habits, it's less than expected. And while votes are one piece of international engagement at the United Nations, this clearly didn't lead me to a distinct answer. So another aspect I explored was speeches, which countries give regularly to express their perspectives on certain issues, including ongoing conflicts like the war in Ukraine. Assessing Brazil's rhetorical shift in regard to great power conflict specifically is important to the aim of this thesis because it is literally Brazilian leaders telling us what motivates their foreign policy decisions. In order to fully understand how Brazilian leaders present their foreign policy in official spaces like the UN, I use a structural topic model, or STM, to analyze the rhetoric they use. STM is a type of statistical model used to uncover topics that appear in large bodies of text. So in my case, I took over 60 speeches given by Brazil on the topic of great power conflict at the United Nations, run those speeches through the model, and then the model shoots out different topics that are most prevalent in the speeches, sorted by both the words themselves and then also organized by documents. So for the purposes of my thesis, I'm looking just at the words and not at the documents as a whole. Each topic represents a trend of key words, in my case, phrases and sentiments, and what people and or countries, in this case, Brazilian leaders, are saying, allowing for a deeper understanding of the themes that dominate their discourse. By identifying and grouping these topics, STM reveals how Brazil's diplomatic rhetoric shifts over time. And after running the analyses on Brazilian speeches about different great power conflicts over the past 30 years, so I looked at a handful of different conflicts, including the war in Ukraine, the Syrian civil war, and the Kosovo war. The STM model identified these 3 topics. So topic 1 is diplomacy, global leadership, and peace talks. Topic 2 is international security and Security Council responsibility. And topic 3 is human rights, conflict, and refugees. And quickly, these are some of the words that were listed under each topic. So like topic 1 is peace, president, war, talk. Topic 2 has words like council, security, resolution. And topic 3 had words like conflict, human, casualty. So these are some examples of the words that were sorted into each topic. Then I use the same data to chart the frequency of these topics over time. This chart is the result. So as you can see, the red line is topic 1, the green line is topic 2, and the blue line is topic 3. So what stands out from this chart? The primary observation is that while topics 2 and 3 have changed in prominence over time, topic 1 remains remarkably constant, regardless of the year or conflict in question. Since this topic is about diplomacy, global leadership, and peace talks, this suggests that Brazilian foreign policy consistently emphasizes diplomacy and peaceful solutions to conflict, regardless of who the president is at the time, the global order, the type of conflict, etc. So no matter the context, Brazil's position on great power conflict appears to be grounded in these values. But this does leave a question, which is, if Brazil's foreign policy is truly anchored in principles like diplomacy, human rights, and adherence to international law, then shouldn't the country unequivocally support Ukraine, a nation whose sovereignty and human rights are under threat due to the war Russia has imposed upon them in their blatant violation of international norms? So with that question in mind, I had to shift a little bit. And this is where my considerations outside the United Nations come into play. Because as some of you might have anticipated, what countries say in the United Nations and what they do, how they vote, might not always be representative of how countries act outside of these official spaces. So over this past summer, I conducted a handful of interviews with Brazilian diplomats, military leaders, professors, etc., in order to understand what else, outside of its traditional principles, motivates Brazil to not completely side with the West and Ukraine in this instance. 2 key themes emerged. First, every single person talked about either fertilizer, the economy, or both. You see, one of Brazil's main industries is agriculture, producing a huge percentage of the food consumed by the rest of the world. This agriculture doesn't grow on its own, though, and requires a lot of fertilizer. Russia is Brazil's largest supplier of fertilizer, providing for about 23% of the country's needs. Thus, Brazil must maintain at least some semblance of a relationship with Russia if they hope to continue trading, especially this very precious commodity. Furthermore, it's in Brazil's best interest that Russia maintain its own economic well-being. For example, when the West imposed sanctions on Russia at the beginning of the war, Brazil decided not to support them. And this is because actions like this on the part of the US present extreme challenges for states in the global South. That is, if Russia collapsed, countries like Brazil would no longer have a secure source for necessary imports like fertilizer. So first, Brazil needs to maintain a positive relationship with Russia and needs Russia not to collapse the hands of the West in order to obtain these commodities. The next economic consideration, China. Since 2009, China has been Brazil's largest trading partner, sending necessary goods to the country like manufacturing equipment, semiconductors, and pesticides. While China is not an active player in the war and maintains a neutral position in spaces like the UN, It is considered a global superpower and Russia's most influential strategic partner. Thus, countries like Brazil must consider their economic ties to Russia when calculating their response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Okay, so that's the economic side. Next, what many Brazilian foreign policy representatives told me is that much of Brazil's hedging position is stemmed in leaders' perception of an unjust global order. This unjust global order is in reference to the belief from many countries in the global South that there's a hierarchy in global politics ruled by Western nations, particularly the United States, and that this order puts developing countries at an inherent disadvantage. Leaders of Russia and China share this view and are increasingly shifting away from the international liberal order that has existed since the end of the Cold War. This perception has existed for many years now and has manifested itself in the creation of organizations like BRICS, or Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, which was created to provide a platform for emerging economies to coordinate economic and political efforts in a global order dominated by Western-led institutions. So long as organizations like the International Monetary Fund, World Bank, and the UN Security Council are dominated by Western developed countries, Brazil views itself as an outsider, left out of a club of wealthy nations led by the US and its allies. Given this context, it is likely that siding with Russia, or at least not completely with the West on the conflict in Ukraine, is part of an attempt to shift the world order Brazil views as problematic. Political scientist and former Brazilian diplomat Dr. Krauss said as much when he told me that Brazilian leaders are proactively siding with what they perceive to be a burgeoning non-Western alliance. So how can we understand Brazil's two-pronged response to the war in Ukraine, which is driven by both ideology and principles, but also its practical needs? And the answer is the policy of principled pragmatism. And what does the policy of principled pragmatism entail, you might be asking? Basically, it combines pragmatic, practical approaches to foreign policy with moral and legal principles in decision-making processes. It's not a rigid, comprehensive theory, but rather a framework for navigating complex situations by balancing interests with ethical considerations. So how does this apply to Brazil? A Brazilian professor and military officer whom I interviewed summed it up best. On the one hand, Brazil has a long diplomatic tradition. On the other hand, we have economic needs. To balance this, Brazil has to align with countries on some topics and not others, not tying themselves completely to one country or another. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the ultimate finding of my thesis, explaining how Brazil can be both a close US ally and reject its responses to great power conflicts, such as the war in Ukraine. Now it's time for the summary and implications. First, summing up the findings. As I found through an analysis of UN votes and historical review, Brazil is increasingly diverging with the US in its response to great power conflict. Next, through my mixed method approach of conducting a sentiment analysis and my own interviews, I found that Brazil's motivations for this divergence come from both the country's ideology and its principles and its pragmatic interests. Thus, the policy of principled pragmatism explains Brazil's nuanced response to the war in Ukraine. This pretty much answers my specific research question that what motivates Brazil's response to the war. But how do we answer this broader question? How does this apply? What are the broader implications, and what does this answer say about how middle powers respond to great power conflict? In regards to the war in Ukraine, Brazil's response and motivations reveal that not all countries view the war through the same moral or strategic lens as the West. For Brazil, the Ukraine war is not about territorial integrity, but also about maintaining economic resilience, diplomatic flexibility, and regional leadership. This underscores the limits of coalition building around Western norms and engaging with the global South. As much as the US would like to believe that its less developed allies are fully aligned with Western ideologies and priorities, this clearly is not the case. Next, Brazil's hybrid response to the war in Ukraine requires a rethinking of traditional perception of middle power behavior as passive players or balancers in global politics. As made clear through this thesis, Brazil pursues strategic autonomy by blending normative commitments with material issues, rather than aligning fully with one major bloc. This finding has implications for how analysts assess other middle powers like, say, India or South Africa, many of whom similarly engage in a strategy of hedging. Thus, if the West hopes to maintain a strong coalition of diverse allies and combat rising influence from China and Russia, existing norms must change, addressing the specific needs held by countries in the global South. Finally, in the war in Ukraine and in times of great power conflict more broadly, the United States must appeal to these needs, recognizing that countries like Brazil are concerned for their personal development, that their foreign policy should not be understood as black and white, and that the policy of principled pragmatism prevails. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gabby, for the Q&A. Please come sit next to me. There's your mic. And the first question, as I mentioned, traditionally goes to the faculty advisor. So give it away to Dr. Stoner. Professor Stoner.
Watching this project develop and evolve and your skills develop as well. And I've learned a lot. So I guess I have two questions before I say congratulations. One is, okay, so I've pushed you on this a couple of times before. So ideology, I think what stunned us was that, you know, Biden asked Lula specifically to give some weapons to Ukraine, and he said, no, I'm not going to do that. And then, of course, most recently for the May Day parade, there was Lula right next to Putin and Xi. And this is a democracy, right? Brazil is a democracy. So at what point do ideology and pragmatism collide? And Brazil is a middle power like this, or India, is forced to choose. So what would happen if the US got directly involved in the war in Ukraine? Would democracy triumph in Brazil's foreign policy, or sort of its ideology, that aspect of it, or would pragmatism? How long is this hedging strategy likely to remain effective for Brazil?
Very good question. I think that democracy and human rights and these different ideologies are very important to countries like Brazil in the way that they present themselves as countries who care about these things, and those principles are foundational. But at the end of the day, these countries are still middle powers and are still seeking to develop further and see this sort of competition where it's either the US is dominating and they don't have access to what they need, they're being left out of these clubs. And I really believe that, and I think this is shown in this situation where development has to come first for these countries. And I'm not sure what would happen if the US got involved in the war. I think at that point, it might not even be a question of democracy and human rights anymore, so much as like, can we fight a war against the US? But at the end of the day, like that in and of itself is more of a pragmatic question, less of an ideological one of the US has the largest military in the world. How could we be against them so actively, and less about democracy?
So it'd still be pragmatic, not ideological. Oh, interesting.
All right, now we open it to the floor. If you don't sit around the table, please wait for the microphone to arrive. And Eliana in the back is helping us with the microphone. And introduce yourself very briefly so we know who you are. Make sure to wait for the microphone so the people online can hear you. And if you want to ask a question, just raise your hand and I will try to get you on the queue. Okay, yeah, in the back, Eliana, please.
Hey, Gabby, great presentation. I'm Raina. I'm a student here at CSAC. My question for you is, you talked about you went through 60-something speeches for Brazil that were related to great power conflict. Could you talk a little more about how you chose these speeches? Because it's difficult to, like, based on the categories you had, I'm trying to figure how you classify your speeches talking about great power conflict and just not talking about it at all.
Yes, totally. So I started by picking the conflicts I was going to look at. So it would be much harder to just have this like broad concept of what is great power conflict I'm looking at over the past 30 years. So I decided to pick 3 conflicts. I looked at the Kosovo War, which was in the late 1990s, the Syrian Civil War, which was in the 2010s, and then now Ukraine. So it's like a very like for each era, there was a war that I looked at. And then the US and China were both involved in each of these conflicts. So there was that aspect where I wanted to make sure that there was truly like these two great powers had different incentives and were at play in this conflict. And then there's a very handy UN database where you can, which has every speech downloaded, and you're able to look at specifically by topic and year. So I would look at the year, or look at the conflict, and then like look up specifically Kosovo War. And then for each year, I just downloaded every speech that had some sort of reference, or not even reference, like that had talks about that conflict specifically.
Then we have Sophie here, and then in the front, please.
Okay. Congratulations on a great presentation, Gabby. I wanted to ask about how the United States administration currently has kind of deviated from what you were identifying as very clear divergence from China and Russia on policy. We see that Trump is maybe less of a predictable actor, especially when it comes to like his stance on the war in Ukraine. How do you think Brazil is going to navigate based on what you've identified with the policy of principled pragmatism, the new sort of world order, or the ways that the United States has diverged from the analysis that you were conducting within the scope of your thesis?
That's a very good question. I think you're right that Trump's foreign policy is much more unpredictable than former administrations. And in the case of the war in Ukraine, his response has been much different from Biden's, where he's much more aggressive and less on Ukraine's side. I think this will be some sort of waiting game where Brazil waits to see what happens in regards to the conflict. They haven't, like, yes, Lula is on stage with Putin and very, very clearly has those relations, but I think like the Russia-US relationship is a lot more complicated right now and unclear what will happen. So there's a waiting aspect. I also wonder how it will depend on how the global order ends up after this, where it's like, will Russia be stronger for this and more aligned with the US, or stronger and less aligned with the US? And then is there even like a hedging position to be had? So all of these things, I imagine Brazilian leaders are considering when talking about the war.
Thank you.
Hi, Gabby. My name is Andrew. I study economics and national security. Thank you for a fantastic presentation. My question has to do with when you graph the topics of the speeches, and you sort of saw that, at least in speeches, the administration of the US or something doesn't have an impact on Brazil's stances. And I wanted to ask, sort of from like a medium power perspective, I think a lot of times, like we think of the US as like politically volatile right now. I feel like middle powers tend to be even more politically volatile, and they appeal a lot to sort of rhetoric about either like nationalism, or I think a lot of like Trumpisms that we think about. So I wanted to ask you, is like sort of like holistically, outside of your main methodology, do you think that a Trump presidency, or sort of like a differing administration like we have now, would impact Brazil's stances? Like, would they be like, this is like a strong man who like talks and thinks this way? Should we like, do we like him more? Should we align with him more? Like, how much do you think that actually impacts policy for Brazil, rather than like the specific instances that you looked at and the words that they use and stuff like that?
That's a good question. So generally outside of great power conflict, Brazil's foreign policy is pretty constant, where it's similar to the US, where historically like issues like economics are very, in the US, like immigration is very political, but foreign policy is a little more established. And Brazil tends to be the same, where its foreign policy is more consistent, more constant, with these like gradual shifts away and not big changes year by year. And I think with the Trump figure, or say a political leader who is strong to the other side of Trump, like it really depends on how that would help or hurt Brazil's pragmatic interests. Like if Brazil really cares about representing the global South and fighting this Western dominated hegemony, like then a leader like Trump poses a greater threat, where Trump he doesn't care about the global South and them being represented at the UN or in the World Bank or anything. So in theory, if there was a leader who was strongly advocating for those same needs and that same representation, then I imagine that they would shift towards aligning more with that president and liking that president more. But they still are thinking about those very pragmatic needs when looking. And overall, like US presidents usually aren't thinking about Brazil specifically.
All right. Thank you so much. We have to move on to the Emma Barrosa with her presentation, Behind Closed Doors or on the Record, the Role of Publicity on Nuclear Wargame.
My name is Emma Barrosa, and I wrote my thesis on the role of private versus public war games on war game behavior. In 1989, somewhere in the greater DC area, Dr. Condoleezza Rice took part in a classified war game that imagined a strike on the US government and tested how a small group of high-level leaders would keep the government running. That experience stayed with her. And on 9/11, when the US went to DEFCON 3 and President Bush was unavailable trying to get to a safe location, she knew exactly what to do. She got on the phone with Vladimir Putin, not to escalate, but to reassure him. DEFCON 3 was not about Russia. It was about protecting themselves, the United States of America. That one call helped prevent a single moment from spiraling into global misunderstanding. She later reflected a few months ago to me that her 9/11 response came directly out of that 1989 wargame experience, crediting the wargame with shaping her instinct to reassure Putin and prevent a broader crisis on 9/11. Wargames have been and will continue to be vital tools for decision makers. They help decision makers navigate crises and develop new strategies and tactics in real time. Within this thesis today, I will first discuss the varying information environments in which war games can be played in, and then I'll explore my research question, how I used war games as an experimental tool to study human decision-making, my main findings, and lastly, my conclusion and recommendations for future research. So war games are most often played in one of two information environments. The first is the private setting. Private war games, like the one Dr. Rice experienced in 1989, allow participants to grapple with classified information, from threat assessments to secure locations to sensitive strategies, without public scrutiny or tipping off adversaries. Institutions that typically host these classified war games are related to the government and contain sensitive information. And so here's an example of one classified war game, only recently declassified about 50 years later. You can still see here, a lot of the participants are redacted to this day. The second information environment we most commonly see war games being played in is the public setting. And these public war games are often hosted by think tanks, academic institutions, even companies like IBM, which hosts a lot of cyber war games, and McKinsey & Company, and nonprofit organizations war game. And they focus on crisis scenarios related to their mission, similar to the government, and the results and transcripts uniquely are shared openly online. Here's an example. You can see a very public war game played by the House Select Committee in Washington, D.C. And in 2023, they played a China-related tabletop war game. And when I say tabletop, I just mean the war game's on the table and they're playing it physically. And these players were members of Congress, and this is a quite public environment, right? You see a camera, you have the game administrator announcing the moves. Very much so, there's an audience. Even here, this is a Center for a New America's Security war game. And this was recorded and published online with moves and dialogue attributable to participants. So war game results do not occur in a vacuum, right? They're shaped by both the game design, the game context, and also the game environment. And I'm trying to explore, how does the information environment in which people are playing in influence how participants behave, and what outcomes emerge from this? Intuitively speaking, I think most of us would feel that we would change our behavior when under observation. And unsurprisingly, there are several psychological frameworks dating back to the Hawthorne effect that help us understand how these effects work and to what extent. And so this instinct to adjust our behavior under observation when you're being watched can also potentially be applied to wargaming. In March 2013, for example, Indian and Pakistani officials played a simulated nuclear crisis game in Sri Lanka. But the observers, the audience, and the game administrators were Americans from the US Naval Postgraduate School. And a lot of the game time reports later noted that players' actions seemed as much about sending signals to the audience as about winning the game. And it became clear to me from this game specifically, who was watching shaped how that particular game was played. And so that idea led me to my research question: how does publicity affect players' behavior in a nuclear war game in terms of hawkishness and dovishness? And so to study this, I ran 18 sessions of the same nuclear war game, changing only one thing, the information environment, public or private, to see how it might influence players' behavior. I focused on nuclear weapons as my key dependent variable, since it's a widely controversial, deeply consequential decision, often considered taboo. My two hypotheses are as follows. The first one is players will use more weapons, both nuclear and conventional, when decisions are private rather than public. And then my second hypothesis was that participants will use more hawkish rhetoric in private settings than public ones. I had a 4-step process to my methodology. I first recruited Stanford students just via email and word of mouth with professors. And then upon collecting about 54 Stanford students, I sent out a pregame questionnaire to gauge their risk tolerance, escalation thresholds, decision-making styles before the war game. I then hosted 18 war games, 9 of which were the public treatment and 9 of which were the private treatment. And along with that, right before the war game, I imposed the treatment as well. And then after each 3-hour war game, participants would fill out a post-game survey asking about their reflections on the game as well as their actions. I held 18 games, but the process was the same every time. 3 participants would meet me in a conference room, either in the Hoover Institution or in Green Library, and I would teach them gameplay for about 15 minutes. The war game I used is quite abstract, quite simple, so 15 minutes is all you kind of need to really learn the game. And when it was time to begin the game, I would pass out their treatment script and then read the treatment aloud. The treatment was about a minute long, and if you were in the private condition, you were explained that I would explain to you that your wargame actions would remain confidential and not be shared outside the room. And in contrast, if you were in the public condition, you would be told that your decisions would be shared widely and trying to highlight the visibility and impact of your choices. After that treatment was imposed, it was time to begin the game, and students would connect their computers to the war game and negotiate every round live in person. The war game I chose to use was a pre-existing war game already created by the Department of Energy in 2019 called Signal. And the way the war game is intended is it's really designed to simulate interactions between major state actors in a geopolitical context. And that interaction can typically go one of 2 ways. I had a lot of participants basically play, quote, farming simulator, as one participant called it, where they don't engage in any violence, no weapons used, purely trading and resource building. But then it can also go another way and go into total war. And so it's really how players make it. Each has their own computer, they're sitting around a table, they can't see each other's screens, and they're trying to collaborate with one another. So I really measured participants' behavior through weapons. And I categorized this use across 2 different weapons types. The first were nuclear weapons, pictured here. This was available in their stockpile. And then the second are conventional weapons, pictured here. They were lumped together and just aggregated in total. Upon completion of all 18 war games, I had 4 different sources of data. The first were the pregame survey responses, and then I also had the game data, so weapons use, the number of nuclear weapons in your stockpile, so then I could standardize it, also the conventional weapons used. And so as participants were playing, I was going around making sure to log how many weapons was this participant using against this participant in my Excel spreadsheet. I also had 18 transcripts, each about 3 hours long, detailing the exact dialogue between participants. Here's an example of a participant trying to negotiate with someone. They're saying that they're about to stage a massive military attack. They want to come to the negotiating table, but participant 7 doesn't want to do that. And so thus participant 8 retaliates. I also collected post-game survey data as well on Qualtrics. So using this data, I explored hypothesis 1 through weapons use and post-game survey responses. And then for hypothesis 2, I studied players' rhetoric to see if I could support this one. Among the 54 participants I had in the 18 war games, 24 were female, 30 were male, and all participants were Stanford undergraduate or graduate students, and I had a majority undergraduates. So for hypothesis 1, I failed to find support, and the hypothesis, just as a reminder, states that exposing subjects to a treatment emphasizing privacy rather than publicness will significantly increase their use of nuclear and conventional weapons in the signal war game. And I first did this by just looking at the means in nuclear use. As you can see here, they're quite similar, with the public having a bit more variability. And then in order to make sure that the difference in nuclear use between public and private games was not meaningful, I used a method called randomization inference. I got a p-value of 0.53, which basically means that the observed effect was likely due to random variation and not a real impact of the treatment. I also did the same for conventional weapons use to check and see if this was a similar pattern across both weapons types. And I found similar patterns. So still with the randomization inference, did not see any differences between the private and public treatment, most likely due to chance, not really the treatment effect. And you can see here, participants did use more conventional weapons just on average, but between the treatments, still not a significant difference. Interestingly, in the post-game interview, this is about 5 minutes after you played the war game, participants were asked in the private treatment, okay, what if your actions were now made public? Would that be okay with you? Half said yes, and about half said, no, I don't want that becoming public. I use nuclear weapons. And interestingly, I found the ones that were saying, no, please don't make this public, they deployed about 1 nuclear weapon more than the ones that were like, I'm very comfortable with this being public. They also explained, the ones that were like, no, I don't want this to be public, they explained that had they been in a public setting, they would have been more cautious, less aggressive, more diplomatic, more mindful of how their actions and words might be perceived. Many described avoiding escalation, choosing words more carefully, thinking more strategically about alliances in front of an audience. I have 2 different explanations for this phenomenon. The first is what I brought up initially, the observer effect. People change their behavior when they know they're being watched. Some participants said they would have acted differently in public, suggesting maybe an internalized norm that, nuclear weapons are a taboo. I don't want this to be observed. I'll be looked down upon. I think the second is a little more compelling in the sense that there's this kind of social desirability bias. The follow-up question itself may have led participants, especially those who use nuclear weapons, to walk back their choices to align with what they thought was the right or expected answer. So yeah, those are my 2 kind of explanations for that. And that kind of reveals a gap in how we think about how we would behave and how we actually behave. And I think that's just a testament for a lot of my hypothesis here. And so while participants were measured in terms of weapons use, language and interaction between participants is also super important in a war game and carries significant weight. And so in order to do this and capture rhetorical patterns, I analyzed game transcripts to examine the presence of hawkish and dovish rhetoric between information environments. So to examine this difference, I conducted a qualitative content analysis of player dialogue across groups, and I systematically coded for rhetorical themes between hawkishness and dovishness, and these are my main themes. So for dovish rhetoric, players frequently made direct appeals to peace by proposing non-aggression and emphasizing the counterproductive nature of war. For instance, if we maintain the equilibrium of none of us putting markers on each other, we can rebuild. Trade and resource sharing proposals emerged as a common strategy as well among players that used dovish rhetoric. They sought to establish economic ties rather than resorting to military competition, as you can see here. Players also established formal agreements and mutual security frameworks, and many participants also proposed basic non-aggression pacts. If you remove mine, I'll remove yours, referencing some signal that was placed on one of their lands. In terms of hawkish rhetoric, we see kind of unambiguous statements that establish potential threats of force. Most threats connected to specific actions, as you can see there. They also established territorial claims over existing and new land through direct statements of ownership. And betrayals also were quite frequent. They involved breaking established agreements or secretly preparing aggressive actions while maintaining peaceful appearances. And when I finally aggregated all of these according to treatments, I found that there were very similar frequencies of dovish and hawkish rhetoric across treatments. There was no statistically significant difference. And I think, so yeah, so my hypothesis too is unsupported. And I think there are three possible reasons for these results. The first is that just generally the treatment of reading the script, having participants read this before the game, and then kind of going into the game, not really going back to it, could have just been too subtle, or the content itself could have been too subtle. The second was that there, like, even with a stronger treatment, there was no strong influence, even with a more salient treatment. And the third, which I think is a bit more convincing, is that there was just limited statistical power with 18 wargame groups. Typically, with signal war games being used as experiments, we see iterations of like 100 signal games or 400 signal games. And with only 18, I wonder if the statistical power was not high enough for us to even begin to find any significance. I'll also add, and this will go into my final conclusions, I wonder if, because my kind of convenient sample of Stanford students didn't really connect to the treatment as much, and I wonder if I had used political elites or people with a bit more of a reputational concern at hand, if we would have seen more of a statistical difference. And I'll get into that later, and happy to chat about that in the Q&A as well. So just some concluding thoughts. The information environment between the private and public information environment did not significantly change how participants behaved in the signal war game. However, some participants thought it would, and even communicated that after the war game. But that just highlights the gap between perception and behavior. Many people subscribe to the observer effect, and yet in practice, it oftentimes is not applicable. So for future research, I would really love to see political elites be included in this methodology to try to see if there's specific heightened career concerns for them. I would also be interested to see if different types of observers, so I told participants that their results would be going online because that's typically a public information environment. Your results are recorded and going online, but it'd be interesting to see if like superiors are around you as you're wargaming, how that would change behavior. I also think it's important to note Signal is a very abstract game. It has country orange, country purple, country green. You technically have nuclear weapons, and they do disproportionately affect land. But I think if you had a more realistic war game like the Taiwan crisis strait that a lot of think tanks play in DC, it would be interesting to see if that would amplify reputational concerns and affect decision making. And so these are all areas for future research and that I hope to accomplish someday. But yeah, happy to get into questions and really honored for the support I've had throughout this year. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Emma. Please join me at the front. I see a bunch of questions already, but as mentioned earlier, and please keep signaling, and I'll see you later. But the first question, sorry? Signaling, haha, fun not intended. But first question goes to Professor Fearon.
Right. Thanks, Emma. That was great. And congratulations. This was, I've advised quite a few undergraduate theses over the years. I think this is the first time that I had someone do an experiment like this, and it was really quite ambitious to put it all together and run it. And I found it, what you did, really fascinating. I want to press you a little more on what to take away, what to conclude from what you found. Well, I don't know. Maybe some of my own speculation, driven by reading your thesis. It's clear that they're playing a game. They knew that they were playing a game.
Mm-hmm.
It looked like a game that you might play for fun, and they approached it like they're playing a game. And so there's that one question that raises is, can we really, how to think about the value, what can we learn from this about a real, crisis or decision making? And I'm of two minds about that. It could be that not a lot about, say, publicity or so on, because they know that, like, even if I nuke you, it's not real, it's just a game.
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe it's that in reality, people get into the same, like, we've got to win. I mean, you could interpret it like, well, the pressures and constraints of the game itself overrode any of these other considerations. Maybe that's true in the world to some degree.
Yeah, I think for the most part, a lot of participants viewed it as a game, and I think you got it spot on. But I also saw a lot of participants that were recruited for the study because they were international relations majors, and they knew in the future they would be in a similar scenario at the State Department or etc. And rhetorically, I saw a lot of them referencing their future line of work as reasoning for some of their behavior. And so while I think a lot of Signal was gamified, you had about 20 participants in there that were not treating this as a game, but like professional, like preparation.
Do you think they were really concerned? Those remarks were not just joking?
I mean, we could go back and forth about the tonal analysis of it, but I feel like I had a few talk about their security clearances and their reputation like that. And then could you explain your second point a bit more?
Well, I'm trying to think of like what can we, it's a really interesting environment, but
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering what are the kinds of effects we can learn about. It seemed, your analysis, you have a whole bunch of things about, there is a degree of realism in that they do all kinds of things that we do observe in the real world,
Yeah.
like making coalitions and making
Absolutely.
trades and reciprocity and threats and all that.
Right. Yeah, so that's a good point. I do have a good section of my paper about just the general trends that we do see that are related to like international relations. We see this dovish rhetoric and appeals to peace that we can map onto like real politics these days. So I think in that sense, a lot of the political interactions and negotiations that were going on is not just game, but that's what we see in real life. And I think that's when Dr. Andrew Reddy and Dr. Bethany Goldblum were creating this game at the Department of Energy, I think that was their real intention, is to examine how these interactions occur, and then how can we compare that to real life. Perhaps the nuclear weapons, conventional weapons, are not treated as realistically as maybe I would like. But for the most part, I think these negotiations could be realistically seen in the futures connected to current events. Thank you so much. Yeah.
All right. And then question in the back, and then next, Professor Sagan.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. This was super interesting. I'm really curious if you did any analysis on demographic factors like gender and how that might have impacted behavior during the war games.
Yeah, so that's a divisive part of literature. There was some literature previous to this that was looking at how testosterone and gender, if there's any correlation between testosterone and gender in kind of like aggression in war games. And they found their results to be conclusive. I ran a randomization inference to examine the like weapons use between males and females. I found no correlation. So I think it's very dependent on the war game itself. But yeah, that's a great question. I was very interested in that as well. Didn't find anything.
Professor Sagan.
Yeah, well, this is very interesting. I buy this argument about social desirability influencing people intuitively. But I wonder whether you could speculate whether social desirability went beyond the nuclear taboo issue, which some people would say that's what's socially desirable. People also have social desirability to not be accused of being an appeaser, or to show that you are tough and credible and follow up with your threats. In Reid Pauly's international security article based on declassified war games, he also found some evidence of what he called conformity, that people did not what they thought they really wanted to do, but what they thought the president would have wanted them to do. So those other kinds of social desirability, did you see any evidence of that in your reports when people were talking about why they did what they did?
So in terms of conformity effect, I did not, but I think in order for me to see a conformity effect, well, in terms of like this staging of the question, I think players were conforming to that like status quo. Like dropping nukes is probably not the most favorable thing you want publicly. So they were conforming to that idea. But when I've read about the conformity effect in both wargaming literature with Reid Pauly and elsewhere with like the Federal Reserve's Federal Open Market Committee, they had a natural experiment where they were looking at the conformity effect and how juniors were changing their behavior to mirror that of the senior because they were concerned about reputational concerns in a public environment. I think in order for us to look at that, we have to have kind of that senior figure. And I don't know necessarily in like a lot of my war games if I had that kind of senior figure, because they were all kind of students of wargaming, the same type of demographic and background.
All right, I think we have time for about 2 more questions. So we'll take Izzo in the back and then Rose Guatemala in the front.
One of the things I learned from you, Emma, about wargaming is how the role of the note taker is really important, and how oftentimes historically in wargaming we've seen the note taker identify patterns, trends, key winning strategies in true like wargaming context for dealing with crises and in conflict. And I wondered, as the note taker, if there are any patterns that you observed that maybe you weren't comfortable making a kind of analytical analysis of or presentation of today, but that you are left wondering about.
I would say that a lot of the way I noticed signal being played out was the first 5 minutes really matter. And so if you have a really opinionated individual in this group of 3 that puts forth an approach right away and says, this is what we're going to do, mostly in terms of like peace talks and maintaining cooperation, it will happen. And so I think the first 5 minutes of setting policy and setting kind of your intentions for the game was really important. I had some groups that spoke maybe like 5 minutes in total and just didn't speak at all, kind of started the game and didn't set policies and were very secretive with one another. And a lot of times it ended in nuclear weapons use, and the policies were all over the place. But then I had others that put their policies up front, communicated, and you saw this kind of general use of the similar policy throughout the game. And often the ones that communicated the most were the ones that didn't use as many weapons. So those were kind of my initial thoughts that didn't really get into this paper, but thanks for asking that.
And Rose Guatemala, please.
Yes, thank you, Emma. Super interesting.
Thank you.
I too am impressed that you ran this experiment. It's a lot of work. But I was just wondering, maybe I missed it in your initial presentation, but were the players playing as the head of state or government at the highest level? Because in our
Yeah.
system, it's, you know, the unique decision of the president to use nuclear weapons. So were they instructed to play with a kind of presidential hat on?
That's a great question. Yeah. So they were essentially the presidents of their countries
Okay.
playing this war game. Yeah. Good question. Yeah. Thank you.
All right, we're already at half past, so please join me. Last but not least, we move to Nicole's presentation, evaluating SGBV outcomes and hybrid tribunals.
But you get credit for playing the game. I do really understand. And then you get a letter grade. So you're not gonna sign up.
Hi, everyone. My name is Nicole Benalcázar-Pavlik. I'm a senior studying international relations. And today I'll talk about my thesis, which is titled Accountability and Hybridity, Evaluating Sexual and Gender-Based Violence Outcomes in Hybrid Tribunals. Please note that this is a heavy topic, as you can tell by the title. Now, when I cry, I feel better. These are the words of Mariam, a Sudanese woman who was gang raped by militia fighters. Right now, at this very moment, a war rages in Sudan between government-backed forces and paramilitary fighters. The US State Department has deemed the acts of these fighters genocide. After the assault, Mariam attempted to take her life, but now she is part of a support group that she founded for sexual violence survivors to tell their stories to each other, to cry, and to drink coffee. Countless women in Sudan, like Mariam, have experienced sexual and gender-based violence, or SGBV for short. SGBV is not a new phenomenon in armed conflict. In fact, as in the case of Sudan, it can be a defining feature of hostilities and used as a weapon of war to instill terror in targeted populations. In 2023, the United Nations confirmed 3,688 cases of conflict-related sexual violence, with women and girls comprising 95% of these cases. And these numbers may actually vastly underestimate the real number of SGBV cases. There are various mechanisms that exist to respond to this issue, and one of those is the law. There are two key bodies of international law that can be used. One is international humanitarian law, which is the law regarding armed conflict, and the Geneva Conventions are a main part of this law. The second is international criminal law, which is a body of law that looks at international crimes, including genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. And these crimes can be prosecuted in hybrid tribunals, which are the types of courts that I'm going to study in my thesis. So what even is a hybrid tribunal? A hybrid tribunal is a court that uses both national and international law and has both national and international staff. It's often created in post-conflict settings and is meant to be temporary. From 2000 to 2007, there were 6 hybrid tribunals. And I was interested in how these tribunals prosecute SGBV. So to look at this idea, I examined 3 case studies: Sierra Leone, Cambodia, and East Timor. So I'll give some more context on these tribunals and then talk about existing literature. Then I'll go into my research question and then the methodology that I used to answer this question. And then I'll go into one of my case studies, which was the case of Cambodia. And then I'll end with my findings and implications. So how did these tribunals even come into existence? Well, it really all starts with these 2 courts: the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia and the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. The ICTY was established to address war crimes that occurred in the Yugoslav wars in the 1990s, and the ICTR was established to address the 1994 Rwandan genocide. These courts were located outside of the country where crimes were committed. So the ICTY was located in The Hague in the Netherlands, and the ICTR was located in Arusha, Tanzania. International staff almost exclusively supervised court activities. And since these courts were so internationally dominated and located outside of the country where crimes were committed, people from the former Yugoslavia and from Rwanda became apathetic to the courts and sometimes even opposed to them. They also were extremely expensive. So, for example, if we look at 2010 to 2011, which is just 1 year, the ICTY cost $300 million and the ICTR cost $257 million. And critics argue that there were very few convictions for the amount of money that was spent. So hybrid tribunals were created as a response to these criticisms, both in costs and also in the felt distance between these courts and the populations that were actually affected by the crime. Existing literature discusses the overall effectiveness of hybrid tribunals, and scholars look at how national and international staff interact. And they also looked at the evolution of SGBV jurisprudence in international law, concluding that the ICTR and the ICTY were critical to furthering SGBV-related law. They also point to the ways that these courts addressed SGBV by having a gender advisor, protections for SGBV witnesses, and staff with expertise on SGBV. They also note that there was a positive correlation in the ICTY between the amount of female staff and the existence of crimes looking into SGBV. So SGBV prosecutions, however, are understudied in hybrid tribunals, so I wanted to bridge that gap. So my thesis question was, how does the combination of national and international elements impact the outcomes of sexual and gender-based violence cases in hybrid tribunals? To answer this question, I used a case study using the method of difference design. The method of difference design looks at least two similar cases, but with one crucial difference and a different outcome. The crucial difference is the independent variable, and the different outcome is the dependent variable. So like I said, I looked at Cambodia, Sierra Leone, and East Timor. Those were the similar cases. And the similarities were that they were hybrid tribunals established with UN involvement. All trials but one were located in country. They were established to address crimes in conflict, and women in each of these societies did not have equal status to men at the time the tribunals were created. The crucial difference, however, was the degree to which each court incorporated national and international elements. The Cambodian court was more nationally dominated, whereas the Sierra Leonean and East Timorese court were more internationally dominated for various reasons. And so that was my independent variable. The dependent variable was the outcome of an SGBV case. So by outcome, I defined that as, was there a conviction, and then what kind of conviction? I looked at three key elements to study this idea. The first were investigative procedures, since that's a key place where national and international staff interact, as demonstrated in the literature. I also looked at gender sensitivity. By that, I mean, was there female representation, and was there gender expertise in the court? And that was done in the ICTY and ICTR. And then within that, I looked at witness protection to see if SGBV witnesses had protection, since they would be more likely to testify transparently with that protection. And then finally, I looked at applicable law to understand judges' reasoning and if national or international law was used to convict. So to start off, I'd like to talk about one of my case studies, which was the case of Cambodia. So from 1975 to 1979, a communist group called the Khmer Rouge ruled Cambodia and called the country Democratic Kampuchea. The group committed horrific atrocities, including murder and torture, and its policies led to the death of 25% of the population. In response, the Cambodian government established the Extraordinary Chambers in the Courts of Cambodia, or the ECCC, with UN involvement. This court was a hybrid court, and it closed in 2022 after spending $340 million and convicting 3 defendants. There were 4 cases in the ECCC, cases 1, 2, 3, and 4. But cases 3 and 4 were terminated early due to disagreements between the international and national judges. Generally, the international judges wanted to move forward with the case, but the national judges did not. If we look at the statute, we see that the court was majority national. For example, in the trial and appeals chambers, most judges were Cambodian. And the statute's only mention of SGBV was in classifying rape as a potential crime against humanity. And by that, it means that rape would have had to be widespread and systematic. So the first key element are the investigative procedures. And because of time limits, I'll be able to discuss just one aspect of these procedures, which was the court's setup. So the ECCC used an inquisitorial setup because it used to be, so basically for context, Cambodia used to be a French colony. And so its legal system was based on French civil law, which handles investigations differently than we might be used to in the US. And so the court used this kind of setup. So the way it works is that there were 2 co-prosecutors, one national, one international in the ECCC, and they conducted preliminary investigations. Then 2 co-investigating judges, again, one national, one international, one international, carried out the bulk of investigations. And then these judges would issue a closing order in which they would either indict the accused or they would dismiss the case altogether. And so this is different from what we might be used to in the US in the criminal law system, where the prosecution and defense carry out investigations. So like I said, the system was called an inquisitorial system, and it was unprecedented for a tribunal like this. There were some problems with this system, mainly that the burden of collecting SGBV-related evidence rested on the co-investigating judges who did not focus on SGBV. The main reason for this was Code 6. This was a code that prohibited men from forcing women to have sex, and it was in the Khmer Rouge Code. And this code created an assumption that no rape occurred in the Khmer Rouge regime. However, this was totally false, as evidence of systematic sexual violence did occur in that regime, mostly against minority groups. However, the judges cited Code 6 as a reason to not indict the accused with SGBV, and they did not consider it a crime necessary to investigate. So looking at investigative procedures overall, I found that the domestic aspect of the court was a weakness, but it could have been fixed if the inquisitorial setup was adapted to meet SGBV needs, or if there had been structural changes. Or perhaps if there had been two different judges, maybe there would have been a different outcome. So I say that domestic components weaken outcomes, but with a question mark, because it's unclear if investigative failures were a direct result of the domestic aspects of the court, or if it was a structural problem. So next, let's turn to the next element, which is gender sensitivity and including victim support. So like I said, gender sensitivity just means, was there gender expertise and was there female staff on the court? The internal rules of the ECCC originated mostly from Cambodian civil law procedures, which did not consider gender. Therefore the court did not account for gender-related concerns or require gender expertise, and so few staff had that expertise. There also was little female representation at the court. At the court's establishment, almost all translators and investigators were men, and 6 years into the court's operations, only 17% of the staff was female. In terms of the victims unit, it was created almost 2 years after the court began operations. It was severely underfunded, and there was no witness protection program. NGOs made up for these structural failures by providing legal and psychological support. This Cambodian NGO called TPO was the primary organization that did this. It's also important to note that 2 women did run the victims unit at different times, which shows that while female representation is important, it by no means guarantees an outcome. Civil parties made up for much of these failures. In the ECCC, victims could become civil parties and therefore play an active role in proceedings and could request investigations. This was unprecedented, and it came from Cambodian national law. Case 2 demonstrates the value of the civil party system in the prosecution of SGBV crimes. Originally, no references to SGBV occurred in this case, mainly because of Code 6. However, civil parties pushed for the inclusion of these charges, which resulted in an indictment with SGBV charges, forced marriage as a crime against humanity. So in looking at gender sensitivity and victim support overall, we see that the domestic aspect of the court weakened outcomes by relying on Cambodian law, for example, but it also made up for these weaknesses via civil parties. At the same time, some of these weaknesses could have been remedied with structural changes. For example, the procedural rules could have included international standards to make up for national deficiencies. Also, the victims unit could have been much better supported. So domestic aspects were a weakness and a strength, and weaknesses could have been remedied with structural changes. Finally, we turn to applicable law, the last of the 3 elements. So like I said, in a hybrid tribunal, both international and national law are applicable, and there were concerns that national Cambodian law would be inadequate when it came to SGBV, which we'll see in the next 2 cases. So in looking at case 1, the trial chamber convicted the accused of rape as a crime against humanity. However, the appeals chamber reversed this decision and classified rape as torture, not a crime against humanity, but then said that the torture was a crime against humanity. If we look at the law that these judges used in the trial chamber, we see that they only relied on international law, including the ECCC statute, which defines rape as a crime against humanity under Article 5, and Control Council Law Number 10, which was used to prosecute Nazi war criminals after World War II. And that defines rape as a crime against humanity. The judges also used ICTY jurisprudence to define rape. The appeals chamber, like I said, reversed this decision in saying that rape had not been classified as a crime against humanity during the time period charged, which was 1975 to 1979. And they could only look at what applied to that time period. According to the judges, such a classification came in the 1990s, but they didn't explain why, for example, Control Council Law Number 10, which came after World War II, couldn't be used. So to decide if they could convict the accused of rape as a crime against humanity, they turned to relevant Cambodian national law, specifically the 1956 Penal Code. And this was the only time that national law was even considered in the ECCC for SGBV crimes. Although rape was criminalized by this code, it did not satisfy the requirements to constitute a crime against humanity, and therefore the accused was not found guilty of rape as a crime against humanity, but instead of rape as torture. So turning to case two was split into two cases, case 2/1 and case 2/2, to get a timely verdict. There were no SGBV crimes in case 2/1, but there were in case 2/2. So here, the accused were found guilty of forced marriage as a crime against humanity under 2 counts, rape and other inhumane acts. And these charges relied on solely international law. The appeals chamber upheld this decision, but there was one disagreement, and that related to male victims. The trial chamber said that men could not be victims of forced marriage as a crime against humanity, and the appeals chamber partly reversed this decision. It's an interesting case, but unfortunately, because of time, I don't have time to get into it. But if you have questions in the Q&A, please feel free to ask. Oops. So in looking at applicable law as a whole, we see that only international law was used to convict SGBV crimes. And this is a benefit of the hybrid system, as international law can make up for deficiencies in national law. So overall, the international aspect was strong and the domestic aspect was weak. So looking at the ECCC overall, we see that in investigative procedures, the domestic component was a weakness. In gender sensitivity and victim support, it was both a weakness and a strength. And then in applicable law, the international component was a strength. However, these weaknesses could have been fixed with structural changes or with different decisions on the part of individuals. So looking at my findings overall, looking at the cases of Cambodia, Sierra Leone, and East Timor, I found that the domestic components could be a strength and a weakness. The international components were a strength, but the key really is structure. Many weaknesses could have been remedied with strong structures or different decision-making. The Sierra Leonean case actually shows the power of strong structures, as this court did have SGBV safeguards, which led to stronger outcomes. So while the hybridity of a court does have an impact, structure and decision-making is actually more determinative of how well a court handles SGBV crimes. So let's go back to women today like Mariam. In 2024, last year, the world hit the highest number of conflicts since World War II. And as sexual violence is often tragically a part of war, allegations of SGBV have shown up in places like Sudan and Ukraine. In the case of Ukraine, the international community right now is deciding whether or not to create a hybrid court or an international court to respond to the atrocities that have occurred. Given my findings on Cambodia, Sierra Leone, and East Timor, it's more important that the focus be on ensuring structural safeguards rather than in the type of court. Thank you.
All right. As always, the first question, if he is here, goes to in the back. Okay, goes to the faculty advisor, Professor Cohen. Where's Eliana? The microphone is coming to you just now.
Thank you, Nicole, for patience. At the end, you said you didn't have time to go into the appeals judgment, but that it would be interesting to do so. I want to sort of give us a hint at what you would have said?
Yes, I would love to talk about that. Okay, so like I said, the trials chamber said that men could not be victims of forced marriage as a crime against humanity, and then the appeals chamber partly reversed that decision. So the trials chamber came to that conclusion because it used a definition of rape which was based on ICTY jurisprudence, and so that court defined rape as penetration, and so therefore men could not be victims of rape. Then that court turned to the other inhumane aspect part, and they had this specific criteria that would have to be met. It included, did men suffer grave like mental repercussions, different things like that, and they determined that they could not make a positive like determination on that. Then the appeals chamber looked at it, and they did not reverse the rape aspect of it, but they did reverse the other inhumane aspect of it, saying that that those kinds of classifications that the appeals chamber or the trial chamber came up with, that they were irrelevant and discretionary.
Thanks, Nicole. All right, so we open it now to the floor. Ileana is in the back helping you with the microphone. If you don't sit at the table we do have the microphones. Please make sure to raise your hand if you want to ask a question, and just introduce yourself very briefly.
Raina again, CSAC again. Just a question from me is, you mentioned hybrid courts were used as a source of legitimacy given the constraints that happened in Yugoslavia and Rwanda. A question to you is, after these courts went through their findings in each of these cases, was there additional legitimacy, or did it differ depending on the strength of the domestic component? Like, you mentioned Cambodia had a strong domestic component, but Timor and Sierra Leone did not. So did that really change how the public saw the outcomes?
Yeah. So you're just asking if the so before there was this idea that like they would be more seem to be more legitimate, but then after like looking at the courts, like was that actually the case? Yeah. So the reason why they would be seen as more legitimate mainly was because of there were like the international components, which would ensure that there were the international standards were met. So there could be no allegations of victor's justice, for example. But then in terms of having like national staff, that made the court seem more justified just in the eyes of local populations. I think in the end, it's really hard to determine how local populations saw the court. There have been surveys, but it's a little bit tricky, and not all courts have done those surveys. Yes, and so I do think in the end, really, if we look at like what people really want generally in these post-conflict societies, is they want perpetrators to be, put in jail basically, and that sometimes it's a tension between that and making sure that there are, safeguards to make sure that like due process happens. And so I guess in the end, it's hard to answer your question because there haven't been like really any definitive studies on how local populations see it, but there is a tension between like what local populations usually want and then what, the international community might want.
Harold and then Rose, please.
Thanks. A great presentation. In other cases with which I'm familiar, just in how the public views courts, there's really at least a couple components, and sometimes it's how effective is the court and how efficacious is the court. In other words, how fast does it reach a decision, and is it effective at implementing it? Can it enforce its decisions? And in the cases you looked at, what is your assessment of the courts compared to the two international tribunals that were criticized and produced this new hybrid model?
Yeah. So in the end, a huge criticism of the international courts was how much money was spent. So for example, in Cambodia and Sierra Leone, a lot of money was still spent. So that really didn't change. But in East Timor, though, there were very severe like budget restrictions. And not a lot of money was spent on that court. But then that caused problems because there weren't enough like structural safeguards. So I guess in terms of that, the cost part really wasn't fixed. And then in terms of like, you're talking about how long these courts take. Yes, it's true that the ICTY, ICTR did take a while. And then the Cambodian court also took a long time, as I mentioned. 2006 to 2006 was when operation started, and then 2022 ended. East Timor was a lot shorter, but the thing about East Timor was that because of the lack of like structural strength, there were a lot of problems. So in the end, perhaps speeding up the court like didn't really help. There were a lot of unresolved cases in the end. And then if we looked at Sierra Leone, that one was also pretty long. And in the end, I can't remember the exact number of people who convicted, but there wasn't like a huge number. So in the end, a lot of those concerns weren't really addressed. I think the enduring appeal of hybrid courts is just that, you know, the national aspect that like domestic populations could see it as a little bit more justified.
Rose, please.
I really get your point about the structural factors being extraordinarily important, but in the end of the day, where do you come down on what should be done in the Ukraine case? National, hybrid, or with that national domestic aspect, or international, given the necessity of reconciliation also between the Ukrainian and Russian people in this case?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think so I would say in general, first I'll say in general and then specifically with Ukraine, because my answer is actually different. I think in general, hybrid courts are a good idea. I just think that you need to make sure the structure is there, and that can make up for a lot of the weaknesses in domestic law. In terms of Ukraine, though, I actually would say an international court might be better. And that's actually what the Ukrainians want. And that's because they worry that Russia and Russians might see the court as illegitimate if Ukrainian law is used. And so in the end, I think for Ukraine, it's better if it's an international court.
Very good.
We have time for some more questions. Do you have one in the back there? Or no? We have time for more questions if there are any more. Yeah, right in front of you.
Hi, Nicole. Thank you so much for such an incredible presentation on such an important topic. I'm Lindsay. I'm also a senior in international relations with an interest in institutions of international justice. I'm interested in hearing more about the distinctions and how rape is prosecuted. You mentioned in case 1 that it was treated as an act of torture rather than as a crime against humanity, whereas in case 2, it did reach that level. Could you just share more about what it means to have a crime against humanity as the label for the crime and what that means in practice?
Yeah, that's an important distinction. So for something to be classified as a crime against humanity, there's actually a lot of different elements that it has to meet, but a key component is that it would have to be widespread and systematic. So for example, like if there's one individual case, that wouldn't count. But if there was like a campaign where like a group perpetrated like sexual violence, not just one person, but like that group just like perpetrated sexual violence amongst like many people, then it would be then it could be a crime against humanity. And so in the end, it is a bigger deal if it's classified a crime against humanity, because it shows, for example, in the Cambodia case, that was a Khmer Rouge policy to enact a certain goal. Whereas if it's not classified as a crime against humanity, it doesn't have that weight and it's more kind of like a one-off case. Yeah.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking Nicole for